Portanto, começaremos hoje com o professor Günter Berghaus, que nos falará sobre então, esta Conferência Futurista de Almada, em abril de 1917. É um tema do qual eu conheço muito bem, obviamente, sendo a pessoa mais conhecida sobre os estudos sobre o futurismo. Vou apenas relembrar alguns dos dados biográficos do professor Günter, nomeadamente em 1977 ele doutorou-se numa tese sobre teatro em Viena no final do século XIX, na Universidade de Berlim, tendo depois, ainda no final dos anos 70, migrado para as universidades britânicas, primeiro em 1978 como professor da London University e em 1983 tornando-se professor de estudos de teatro da Universidade de Bristol, onde ele ainda está hoje como Senior Lecturer, Senior Research Assistant, Fellow Research. That's right. Publicou um livro importante neste período, longo dos anos 80, Theatre and Film in Exile, German Artists in Britain, de 1933 a 45, em 89, e depois, nos anos 90, viajou regularmente para o Brasil, organizando performances teatrais, e tendo colaborado nomeadamente com António Mercado Neto no Rio de Janeiro, em São Paulo e em Fortaleza. Em 1998 foi professor convidado da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. Portanto, sabe um bocadinho de português, a conferência vai ser em inglês, mas consegue perceber português. Em 1998 publicou outro livro seminal, Italian Futurist Theatre, 1909-1944, e assim como livros sobre a carreira pré-futurista, digamos assim, de Marinetti, The Genesis of Futurism, em 95, Futurism and Politics, em 96. Desde 2003 que deixou de ensinar e tornou-se então um Research Fellow na Universidade de Bristol. E desde então, entre outras coisas, já nos criou o e-book of Futurism Studies, que de certa forma é uma publicação central sobre então, este assunto do futurismo a nível internacional, e no ano passado publicou o Compêndio Internacional Futurism 1945-2009, a Biblioteca Handbook. Portanto, o professor Günter Berghaus.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here in Lisbon and to speak about 100 years of futurism. Hello. Because this is not actually the first time that an anniversary presents me with an opportunity to reflect on futurism and to discuss some aspects of it that are not all that well known to the academic community. Most of you, I'm sure, will remember the other big centenary in 2009, which was the centenary of 100 years of Italian futurism, which offered a unique opportunity really to take stock of the vicissitudes of Italian futurism in the course of its 35 years of existence. But then in the following years, there were more centenaries, like in 2012, that of the 1912 touring exhibition of futurist paintings that went to various places in Europe. And then in the 1914 Manifesto of Futurist Architecture, which served as an occasion to reflect on Antonio Santilia, and there were several conferences and exhibitions held on that occasion. And now that's of the 1917 publication of Portugal Futurista. Now, compared to the more than 12,000 publications on Italian futurism, the impact of Marinetti's movement here in Portugal has been addressed only by a small number of books and publications. It is therefore, I think, to be commended that the three cities of Rio de Janeiro, in Padua, and now here in Lisbon, decide to honor the publication of Portugal Futurista and to reflect on the effect that this magazine had on the development of modernism here in Portugal. As many of you know, and has just been mentioned, I'm also the general editor of the International Yearbook of Futurism Studies, which in 2013 dedicated a special issue to the Iberian Peninsula. And several of the contributors to this volume are with us here today. I don't want to bore them with a paper that goes over the same ground that they have discussed in this volume of the yearbook. Instead, I'd like to focus on an aspect of Portuguese futurism that is much closer to my home territory, which is theatre and performance. On 11th of October 1910, the Futurists published their first manifesto that was expressly concerned with theatre. It carried the title Manifesto of Futurist Playwrights, but later editions carried different names. The second edition was called Futurist Conclusions on the Theatre, and then what's probably the best known title, The Pleasure of Being Booed. Marinetti and his 19 co-signatories made no secret of their intention. I quote, "We want dramatic art to seize what it is today, namely a wretched product of a theatre industry." End of quote. And for this reason, the 20 futurist playwrights appealed to dramatists to despise the public and encouraged actors to develop a taste for the pleasures of being booed. Marinetti's avant-garde concept of theatre was directed against a public that he regarded as reactionary, passive, lazy, and complacent. In order to shake this audience out of its stupor, he wanted theatre performances to be provocative, to attack traditionalism, and to irritate the social strata that sustained it. Not only did futurist performances glorify war and revolution, they were an act of insurrection that had the effect of a well-primed grenade thrown over the shattered heads of our contemporaries, as Marinetti wrote. So the futurists really used theatre in their battle for a renewal of Italian public life. They wanted to reach a large number of people, and they were fully aware that they could only do so if they extended their newly created movement beyond the elitist media of literature and painting. Marinetti wrote that 90% of all Italians go to the theatre, while a mere 10% read books and journals. And this meant that the futurists chose the theatre not because of its artistic potential, but because it was an effective medium for polemics in an evolving mass society. When Marinetti took to the stage with his entourage of poets and painters, they presented a program that mixed poetry and politics, music and painting, manifesto readings and diatribes against the cultural establishment. And the term that they used for this was Serata. Here you have two examples, two posters for future Serata. In Italian, the term Serata is really used for any kind of evening entertainment, just like the French soirée. But the futurists developed the Serata into a theatrical genre that became one of their most original contributions to avant-garde art and a demonstration of their concept of art in action, arte d'azione. Between 1910 and 1914, Marinetti organized more than 20 Serata. They took place in large theaters and presented the key ideas of the futurist movement to audiences ranging between 2,000 and 5,000. They always contained a combination of manifesto readings and presentations of works of art that had arisen from these theories. And this allowed Marinetti to introduce the Italian public successively to futurist poetry, painting, and then music. The audience reactions to these kind of presentations, they ranged from total indignation via benevolent amusement to enthusiastic admiration. Most spectators came to a Serata with a fair idea of what to expect. Obviously, some were more easily shocked than others, Outbursts of violence occurred quite frequently, either between different sections in the audience or between the artists on stage and the audience in the auditorium, often forcing police to intervene. Although most of the audience voiced their reaction in a spirit of fun rather than aggression, in actual fact it was never a very clear dividing line between the one and the other, because many spectators regarded it as fun to be aggressive towards the performance. And this was what the futurists expected of their audience and encouraged, because it squared with their principal objectives to activate the audience, to make them give up their complacency, to change their attitude towards art as something separate from life. So the Serata were an attempt at revolutionizing the established forms of theatrical communication. Marinetti described the purpose of the Serata as to introduce the fist into the struggle for art. And indeed, these performances were like war bursting into the field of art, and not scandals in the normal sense of the word, i.e. spontaneous eruptions of public ire. Marinetti had planned and organized the Serata in a systematic and logical manner in order to provoke such reactions. He had instituted the Serata with a clear aim in mind, to storm the citadels of bourgeois culture and to turn them into a battleground of a new socio-political praxis. More than any other form of artistic discourse, the Serata aimed at abolishing the autonomous position of art in bourgeois society. Shock and provocation caused by the stage action broke down the fourth wall which traditionally separates the actors on stage from the spectators in the auditorium. Marinetti organized the Serata in a manner that the stage action literally entered the stalls and allowed the audience to take over the main part of the show. At the Serata in the Teatro Verdi in Florence on 12th of December 1913, the performers stood on stage and watched the main action unfold in the auditorium. But let's move from Italy to Portugal. As is well known, Futurism made its entry into Portugal not directly from Milan or Florence or Rome, but via Paris. Mario Gisacanero first reported on Futurist ideas and aesthetics during the time when he studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. In a letter of 13th of August 1915, he reported that he bought a copy of the anthology I Poeti Futuristi at the Gallery Sagot, which he characterized as a cubist futurist temple. A slide of this volume, I Poeti Futuristi. He asked Pessoa to make contact with the futurists and to send them the second issue of Orfeo, which contained his futurist poem Manicure. Guillermo di Santa Rita was another person who had opportunity to study futurism in Paris. He visited the Futurist exhibition that was held at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery, and he attended Marinetti's lecture that he held there on 5th of February 1912. He familiarized himself with Futurist writings, and after making the personal acquaintance of Marinetti, he was given permission to publish a Portuguese translation of Le Futurisme, this first collection of Marinetti's theoretical writings, which had already been translated to Spanish, 1912, printed in Valencia. On 13th of July 1914, Gisacanero reported to Pessoa that Santa Rita had sought his help in this enterprise and had asked him to find a publisher for this Portuguese translation of Le Futurisme here in Lisbon. Now, I think it's very likely that this edition, had it appeared, which in the end it didn't, would have contained the Variety Theatre Manifesto of 1913 and the most recent proclamation on the theatre, Il Teatro Futurista Sintetico. Both manifestos took the ideas explored in the Serata a stage further, with the intention of instilling in the audience a theatrical vivacity that would abolish the proscenium arch and establish a close contact between stage and auditorium, as was typical of the variety theatre. And here you see two examples where the stage is not separated from the audience by a proscenium arch, and as you can see in this here, the interaction between stage and auditorium is the permanent feature of this type of theatre. And therefore I think it is very important and very interesting that on 5th of June 1915, A Capital, the newspaper here in Lisbon, published an article that suggested that the Orfeo group was planning to stage a drama by Pessoa that was inspired by two of Marinetti's plays that belonged to this genre of the Teatro Sintetico. They are called Le Basi and Vengono, and I have two slides here of performances of these two plays in February and March 1915, organized by the Berti Masi Company, and it actually went on tour in Italy to about 12 or even 15 different cities. And loads of newspaper reports about it that were circulating in Europe. The first play, Le Basi, was performed by actors who only show their legs behind a curtain raised some 50 centimeters high. The second is a drama of objects, and you can see here several of these objects, chairs, that are moved around on stage like characters while the lights go on and off, and there are some other lighting effects that were part of it. And it seems that Pessoa was prompted by these performances, or by reading the plays, which were available by that time, to write himself a drama of objects, which a journalist characterized as a dynamic drama entitled Bacchanal, represented only by legs. The curtain rises only to the height of the actor's knees, such that the spectators see nothing but human legs, legs of chairs, legs of tables, macabre and disjointed things dancing around, all of this illuminated by strange lighting. End of quote. The link to the futurist Teatro Sintetico was highlighted by Pessoa in an open letter to A Capital, in which he described A Bebedeira, that's the name of this play, as estudo sintético do jornalismo português. Sintético, used the same term. As it happened, this Portuguese interpretation of the futurist Teatro Sintético did not in the end see the light of day. It was not performed, nor was the lecture on Teatro Futurista no Espaço, which Raul Leao had announced in Orfeo No. 2. But 2 years later, futurist theatre was on the agenda again in the one and only issue of Portugal Futurista. The last pages of the magazine were taken up with the translation of Marinetti's Manifesto Il Teatro di Varietà, and the opening section was dedicated to the Ballet Russe, the season to be opened in Lisbon on 13th of December 1917. Now, given Almada's strong interest in dance, he will have been well informed about the significance of futurism for the Russian company. The most intense period of the futurist collaboration with Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe came in February-April 1917 during the preparation for Parade, and that particular ballet was presented by the company during their Spanish season in November 1917. And then a month later, or a few weeks later actually, in early December, when Diaghilev's troupe arrived here in Lisbon, they were greeted by Almada Negreiros at the train station. However, due to the military uprising against Afonso Costa's government on 5th of December 1917, the company became stranded for 3 months, and their Portuguese season became a financial disaster. And this turn of events was undoubtedly a great disappointment to Almada Negreiros, who had recommended himself to Diaghilev as a potential collaborator. Because in Portugal Futurista, he reminded readers that he and his collaborators had already created 4 ballets between 1912 and 16 and had 2 more under preparation, as he said. The Lisbon season of the Ballet Russe may not have been a great success due to political circumstances, but it offered immense inspiration to the Portugal Futurista group and served, as Isabel Gil judged, as the embryo of what might be rightfully called modern Portuguese dance culture. End of quote. Now, indeed, as far as avant-garde theatre is concerned, there can be no doubt that Almada Negreiros made a major contribution to its introduction here in Portugal. Like Santa Rita, he received a great deal of inspiration from Marinetti. Although, as I mentioned earlier, no production of a futurist drama proper was ever mounted here in Lisbon, the more informal and flexible format of a Serata was adapted in an event that took place on 14th of April 1917 at the Teatro República, today the São Luís Teatro Municipal. That's what it looked like in 1917. If Almada's memoir of the event in Portugal Futurista, some 6 months later, is to be trusted, the audience at the theatre was initially rather well disposed towards the organizers and expected a literary soiree like many others they will have attended on other occasions. Almada Negreiro appeared on stage in a clownish costume that looked like a mix between an aviator suit and a worker's overall. You all know this one. He began the proceedings with the recitation of his futurist ultimatum to the Portuguese generations of the 20th century, occasionally punctuated by improvised interventions from Santa Rita Pinto. And needless to say, these provocations were greeted with consternation by an audience who was expecting something more like a serious lecture on some literary topic. After a while, the irritated spectators did not want to listen any longer to the invective coming from the stage. And this, of course, was exactly what Almada had expected. He must have studied the futurist manifesto of theatre, the playwrights' manifestos, because he referred to the futurist voluntà desarfischiati when he said that he had granted the audience, according to the futurist policy, the right to interrupt the speaker. So, like the Italian futurists, in their Serata, Almada will have prepared himself for negative reactions coming from the audience and will have developed strategies of how to overcome their adversity. Although his own laudatory assessment of the situation sounds a bit suspicious, he said, "I contrast the virility of my assertions with the incompetence of my adversaries." But judging by the review that was published in A Capital, it seems that he did indeed manage to keep the upper hand, and not least because Santa Rita Pinto tamed the beast in the stalls with imperious gestures and intervened when protests from the auditorium threatened to interrupt the soiree. During Almada's lecture, Santa Rita had a chance to study the audience, which included, as is to be expected, many friends and admirers, but also a variety of representatives of the cultural establishment of Lisbon. So, as this was to be expected, he and Almada had prepared a number of scenarios. And one of them, according to the journalist from A Capital, went like this, I quote, "Picking out a spectator, the head of the futurist school insinuates gravely, 'If I'm not mistaken, you're the monarchical critic Alfredo Pimenta. Do talk.' Now, the person in question protests. No, he's only Mr. Astrígido Chaves. No offense, he adds. Again, laughter passes through the hall, making the audience ripple like a ripe cornfield in a gust of wind. Mr. Santa Rita Pinto terminates the discussion and turns to the stage. The argument, he says, is compelling. It has all the weight of Lusitanian integralism. Do carry on. End of quote. Now, Marinetti had taught his followers to despise the public, and Almada paid heed to this advice and ended his recitation not with the customary scraping and bowing, but he walked from the stage through a laughing and heckling audience, kept his countenance as he strove towards the back door, and tartishly waving goodbye to his adversaries. So then the second part started with a reading of Valentine de Saint-Point's Manifeste Futuriste de la Luxure, which caused some of the ladies in the auditorium to walk out in protest. When Almada recited Marinetti's Il Teatro di Varietà, it seems that there were only a few interruptions, and he responded to the hecklers with contempt and gestures of annoyance. Unfortunately, the shortness of reviews forbids us to reconstruct the development of this soirée in any more detail. It seems that in Lisbon, as in Milan and other Italian cities, the tumultuous presentation of futurism to the Portuguese people, as Almada called it, found a rather mixed reception. Some members of the audience were shocked, others bemused. A Capital speaks of laughs and chuckles and a certain disappointment. Dario Ginocesias observed hilarity, booing, laughter, and witty comments. Some spectators affected indifference and considered the event to be a second-rate manifestation of futurism. And others were even more blasé and judged that the talk did not offer much novelty because the futurist ideas exposed were already well known to anybody with a decent cultural education. For the critic of A Capital, it was little more than a curious case of mental pathology. Now, we all know that this soirée at the Teatro República was not Almada's first experience as a performer. He had recited his poems and manifestos at gatherings in cafes like the Martinho. But the choice of the Teatro República gave his recitation more weight and suggested that the Lisbon futurists wanted to emulate their Italian colleagues by presenting their ideas to large audience. Because these cafes in Chiado, there may have been, a few dozen, maybe 100, but not more spectators. But it needs to be said that the choice of the Teatro República, with a capacity of only 500 seats, and judging by the reviews, these seats were not all filled. This theatre then became a rather intimate space compared to the large-scale theatres used by the Italians to accommodate up to 5,000 spectators. And I'm just showing you here the floor plan of two theatres at Teatro Verdi, where a very important Italian soirée was held in the São Luís, and you can see the difference in size. And also, this is probably a little bit misleading because the modern, these are obviously modern photographs, and they don't show it quite as clearly as I think at the time, but you can still see that the Teatro República is considerably smaller. And for a performer on stage, this person will have to do a very different act from someone performing in a theatre of that size. Mass psychology and theatrical experience teaches us that audience behavior in intimate theatre varies very considerably from that in big halls. And furthermore, to fill such vast spaces, 5,000 people in Teatro Verdi, the audience need to be recruited from social strata that extend beyond the normal theatrical habitués and culture vultures. These sections of the audience were described by the Corriere della Sera on the occasion of the Milan Serata of 1910 as, I quote, people who have never been seen before in the theatre and who evidently only come to see a serata, end quote. This is not to say that these audience segments were solely responsible for the rowdy scenes that characterized the Serata Futurista. The critic of l'Unità Cattolica judged, I quote, it was not only the workers perched on the balcony who were throwing potatoes, no. Also the upper classes and the petty bourgeoisie gave a nice demonstration of the civil education they had received in their colleges and grammar schools, end of quote. All the reviews confirm that huge Italian crowds of highly diverse spectators flocked to the Serata and hardly managed enough space or place to sit or to stand. And squeezed and crushed like this for nearly 2 hours, even before the proceedings started, meant that they fomented an electric atmosphere that only needed a spark, to set off an explosion. In comparison to that, I would suggest the soirée at the Teatro República did not attract a broad spectrum of spectators. It remained a fairly genteel affair with a traditional cultured audience, supplemented by a few dozen friends of the artist and the obvious representatives of the intellectual elite, i.e. critics and artists, journalists, publishers, and so on. They were arriving out of curiosity and without preconceived ideas of what to expect from this event. And this was very different from Italy, where the reports on the Serata in the national press, just show you a couple of examples here, attracted a wide range of people who came to the theatre well prepared for what was going to happen. They were not only looking forward to a boisterous evening, they also had filled their pockets with various objects that could be used as projectiles. Before the show began, all vegetable and fruit stalls in the vicinity of the theatre could hang up their sold-out signs. And none of this could be observed here in Lisbon in 1917. So let me come to an end with offering you a summary of the similarities and the differences between an Italian Serata and this Conferencia at the Teatro República. Italy and Portugal were both countries in which the momentous transformations of the Industrial Revolution and the no less precipitous upheavals in the cultural sphere arrived only belatedly, at least compared with the northern countries, the northern European countries. It was thanks to Marinetti that modernism burst onto the European scene in its most avant-garde form in 1909. And in Portugal, it took much longer for this development to take roots, and it never gathered the same momentum. Portuguese futurism never developed the scale nor the range of activities that could be observed in Italy. There were less people involved, and the production of books, periodicals, and works of art was much smaller here in Portugal. And as far as the theatre was concerned, the single and unique Conferencia Futurista at the Teatro República can hardly stand comparison with the more than 20 Serata Futurista that were organized in the years 1910 to 1914, or the hundreds of performances that took place between 1914 and 1944. Now, given these disparities, can the Conferencia Futurista, given by José de Almada Negreiros and Santa Rita Pintor, be put on a par with the Serata Futurista? And my answer would be yes and no. The Lisbon futurist had read the Italians' pronouncements on the theatre and had received information on the performances that resulted, both in the form of the Serata and the Teatro Sintetico. The information triggered in them a desire to undertake something similar here in Portugal, because Portugal was a country no less in need of a radical shake-up than Italy. But it seems that the hurdles to overcome were much higher here in Portugal. In Italy, the Portuguese painters mounted some 35 exhibitions in 1910-1912 and organized an immensely successful touring show to galleries in Paris, London, Berlin, Brussels, Hamburg, Copenhagen, The Hague, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Cologne, Munich, Vienna, Budapest, and even a number of smaller venues. In comparison, the Portuguese futurists showcased their works only half a dozen times in Lisbon, Porto, and Faro. What followed after 1917 was a trickle compared to the torrent that swept through Italy. And consequently, the futurist aesthetics was insufficiently known to the wider public here in Portugal. And in the theatre, the situation was not much different. The great reforms that had been instigated by the art theatres in Moscow, Paris, Munich, and Berlin had found very little response here in Portugal. Therefore, Almada Negreiros and Santa Rita were rightly considering themselves pioneers in their country. Almada confessed, I quote, "I succeeded, inspired by Marinetti's revelations and supported by the genial optimism of my youth, in transforming the pattern of insipidity which all of Lisbon has sunk down to, and in conveying to a curious audience an impression of the intensity of modern life, which of all utopian visions is unquestionably the one that is the most alien and unknown in Portugal." Almada's attempt to shake up the theatrical scene in Lisbon was a mixture of conscious decisions, circumstantial arrangements, and improvisatory reactions to unforeseen circumstances. It was certainly premeditated to hire a medium-sized theatre, to decide on a program of text to be recited, and to develop strategies of how to handle audience reactions. What was lacking, first of all, was an advertising campaign, which in Italy involved plastering the city with posters and banners announcing futurism's entry into the city or carrying out spectacular publicity stunts. And due to this type of publicity, the futurist movement always was the main topic of conversation in the squares and cafes of a theatre, and guaranteed that the theatre was sold out 2 or 3 days before a performance could be held. Then secondly, the Italian Serata were reported on in hundreds of newspapers, like the ones you've seen here. And this meant that after the first shows, all spectators knew what to expect and how to prepare themselves for a Serata. And here's a very nice caricature of this. Police in front of the theatre. What are you carrying in there? We are bringing the applause for the futurists. Now, in contrast, the audience at the one and only performance in Lisbon arrived with the expectation of attending a normal literary soiree. They did not have in their pockets the ammunition that turned the Italian stages into cesspits and caused many painful bruises on the heads of the actors. Here you have 2 more caricatures of these Dantesque scenes. In Lisbon, there was no pandemonium as in the Italian theatres, no fisticuffs, no physical assaults, and hence no need for the police to intervene. Audience reactions in the Teatro República were restricted to verbal altercations, hissing and booing, laughter, witty interjections. But it gave the performers the satisfaction of living up to the objectives outlined in the manifesto, the pleasure of being booed. Now then, thirdly, the program that was arranged for the Primeira Conferência Futurista was short, contained only a few prose texts and manifestos, and involved only 2 actors. In Italy, there were always at least half a dozen performers on stage, and they offered an ample selection of poems, manifestos, sometimes supplemented by presentations of paintings and music, as you can see in this well-known, this is Boccioni's description of the Serata Futurista, where you can see 3 paintings in the background, you can see an orchestra, playing to it, and then the 4 actors on stage trying to keep the audience in control. And then finally, I would say, in Lisbon, there was no after performance. In Italy, not only the publicity stunts before a show took on a performance character, but also the events after the Serata. On many occasions, the police had to escort the artists out of the theatre and protect them from the ire of the anti-futurists. Repeatedly, the futurist artists were arrested, and a cortege of philo-futurists followed them to the police station. And when the performers had been released, they were feted by their friends and supporters waiting outside on the street. Then they celebrated the futurist victory at a local cafe or restaurant. Discussions on futurism continued all night and flamed up again the next day when the local newspapers printed all the reviews of the event. And consequently, my assessment of some 25 Italian serate could take recourse to hundreds of press reports and dozens of memoirs penned by the artists who were involved. And on top of it, these kind of drawings and caricatures that appeared in the press. The abundance of this material allows us to reconstruct events in Italy with considerable detail and precision. And in contrast, I think the performance at the Teatro República was poorly documented and is therefore very difficult to analyze. And I'm fully aware that what I have offered here, that my analysis, rests on rather shaky ground. And I would welcome colleagues to direct their focus on the event and to interpret the cited documents and a few others that you can see in the exhibition here that is held in the adjacent rooms, maybe from other perspectives than the one that I have presented here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Günter. I'll open it for questions. You want to, Sarah? No, I'll have one. Professor, you're saying that a definitive answer to the question, was this a Serata Futurista or no, has a double answer. So yes or no, and you very eloquently discussed why was that. But do you think that, you've mentioned only the reality in Italy, right? When you said about all the other things in the news, the afterwards performances. Do you think, I'm trying you to reconsider your point, but do you think that reality in Italy, in a much larger country, much larger cities, would be the same in mutatis mutandis with what happens here in Portugal, given the size of the country and only one major city like Lisbon? You think the spirit was there, but not the many futurists around?
Well, first of all, in Italy there were many more futurists than existed here. Futurism started in 1909. By 1910, there were already about a dozen that considered themselves futurists. By the time they started their first round of exhibitions in 1912, about 2 dozens were already in existence. And before the First World War broke out, various circles had sprung up across the Italian peninsula, so there were quite a number of smaller local cells. And they all together, by the time of about 1914, 1915, counted to a good 100 people. After the First World War, in the course of the 1920s, that multiplied so that by about 1930, one can count roughly 1,000 futurist artists, or artists who call themselves futurists or participate in exhibitions or other events that carry the label futurist. Not all of these artists were thoroughbred futurists, but they participated in futurist events, and thus, they deserve to be called futurists and have been analyzed as futurists, and their works have been analyzed as futurists. Now, given those numbers, given the kind of continuity over a period of 20 years, I think that is something that needs to be considered, because the audience, the public in Italy with an interest, in cultural matters, very quickly, within about 1 or 2 years, had a fair idea what futurism stood for, not least because also the newspapers were so full of reports. And reports that either could be serious, that could be critical, or just could be, these kind of caricatures. The caricatures, in fact, were very, very important for propagating futurism. And Marinetti, in his famous libroni, which are these scrapbooks, that he kept throughout his career, he avidly collected caricatures of futurism in drawn form as well as in written form. So through the reports, through the polemical articles, and through the caricatures, the audience was very well informed. At least they had a fair idea of what futurism tried to achieve. And this was something I don't think one can say happened here in Portugal. Now, one could, of course, compare Italy and Portugal to a variety of other countries, and that is something which in the yearbook, the International Yearbook of Futurism, we have now been doing for nearly 10 years. We had a look at about 35, 38 different countries where futurism had a significant impact, and you really find that the artistic and cultural conditions of each country is very separate and different from others, and so the forms of futurism or anti-futurism that develop in a given country really depends on quite a large number of factors. And all these factors need to be analyzed in detail by people who are very well informed about the culture of this country. Therefore, I'm always very, very hesitant if someone like me with a background more on Italian futurism is asked a question about Russian futurism or Bulgarian futurism or Spanish futurism. I would always say, I have something to say on the topic, but I'm not a specialist of Russian culture. So I think I would need to know a lot more about a particular city where a group of Russians engaged in some activities. Because also, the Russian futurists, they toured. They had these, they're not troops, they have, a bunch of, artists joined together, and they say, come on, let's go on a tour. And then they spend 3 weeks going to different cities, and, go to the theaters, doing something that is a bit similar to what we talked about today. And again, for these events that took place in smaller provincial cities of the Russian Empire, there are quite a lot of local reports, and if you read them, you get a fair idea of what audience reactions were like, how the futurist performers, did it. But with the Russians, again, I would say one of the fundamental differences is that these performers very quickly became experienced futurist performers. Because once you handle this kind of audience 2, 3, 4 times, you really develop an idea of how to interact. Whereas in this case, there was one performance. There was never a repeat performance, and there wasn't a troupe that was doing it across Portugal, in 5 or 6 or 8 different cities. So they couldn't gather experience. They couldn't learn how to handle audience reactions and direct it more, as they wanted. It was all a very improvised affair. And with it not being reported on very extensively, not a large number of people, I think, ever found out what exactly happened there. And that may have been one of the reasons that there wasn't a repeat performance, that there wasn't a theatre company that put on these futurist plays, either written by Italians or, written by the Portuguese futurists. The theatre just didn't respond very much, to the ideas that this group tried to convey, to audiences here in Lisbon. And so in the end, Portuguese futurism, as I suggested, was a trickle compared to the torrent that you could observe in Italy and also in Russia. And so my answer finally would be, the local conditions very much informed what was possible and what wasn't. The ideas may have been very similar, but what you can actually do, given the structures in which you operate, is really very different from country to country and also from city to city.
Thank you.